Melodena, thank you for coming in. I mean, it's just amazing the work you're doing, and you were introduced by a trusted uh, friend, Marissa, and I've interviewed her several times. So, but thank you for coming in for just all of the wonderful things you're doing, and to share your insights about how you make the world a better place.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, Steph.
So one of the questions I always ask, and my audience primarily, by the way, are executives. So in fact, if you rank them in order, it's founder, CEO, co-founder, president, and board member. That's the order. And then it's professor after that. It's probably sixth place. So, but we're always curious as to, what were the inflection points that made this wonderful career that you have? And this could have been when you were 3 or 5. It could have been in your family or some mentor. Something happened in school. What are those 2 or 3 sort of inflection points that made your life where it is today?
Oh, that's a very deep question. So I grew up in a community of scientists. We lived in a building, there were 100 scientists. And so you understand scientists pursue knowledge for the pure love of knowledge, right? They're not thinking of governance. They're not thinking of what could happen in the future. It's the love of knowledge. And when my father retired many years later, he was an experimental astrophysicist. He used to collect a lot of data from satellites. They used to do balloon flights and collect data. But one of the challenges he had when he retired was he couldn't analyze the data because the software had changed. I saw him running from pillar to post with his computer looking for software, but nothing could happen. And that got me thinking that there were limitations with technology, or maybe when we kept evolving, some old technologies became obsolete very quickly, but we were throwing maybe sometimes the good things out, the baby with the bathwater. And COVID came on, and you saw the rapid adoption of AI. So that was the second inflection point. We didn't even ask questions. We put young children in front of the tube in screens. We started gamifying everything. And then society really changed. And you have to ask that question in 2075, what kind of society do I want? And is technology helping us achieve that societal dream, or is technology leading that dream? And that's how I started.
So your dad had a major impact on your life, and really the sort of him using technology, being able to embrace it in a way that was meaningful, and having kind of sustainability in the use of that technology and the impact it's going to have. And then you saw the impact of COVID and the pandemic and how that really influenced us. And people have to be agile, right? Making adjustments, and there'd be mistakes as well, right? So
And absolutely. And I think if I could just add that one example, when we started, maybe some of us are much older, we saw computers with punch cards, and then we quickly moved into the strip. And then there were these gigantic things that sat on your table. And now we're doing everything from a mobile, but no one taught us the right things and how to use it and what things how to manage it better. So we didn't have the ability to coach the next generation. I would like to rectify that mistake now. So a lot of my work is actually trying to understand what I wasn't able to do before.
I understand punch cards because I've been around working with technology since like the 60s. So from vacuum tubes to actually transistors to integrated circuits, and actually programming even a machine code uh, before we had assembler, and then assembler, and then of course then you had programming languages, and even in the early days you actually had to punch in almost like a mini operating system just to bootstrap your computers, especially when they went to micro. So I mean, I really fully understand that arc that you mentioned. So you have this really interesting immersive background, right? And a community of scientists. You're raised with scientists. Your dad had scientists, and then so did you have a really early interest then in science as well, because you were immersed in all of this science? I mean, well, you
Wanted
became
to be
a
an
scientist.
astronaut. Yeah, I wanted to be an astronaut. And here's the funny story. My dad didn't want a girl being an astronaut because you'd have to stay up the whole night if you wanted to collect data, right? But by the time I graduated, you could program a machine to stay up all night, and you could analyze data when you were awake. So that also is this interesting thing of how technology can change so rapidly preconceived notions. So I didn't become an astronaut. I instead did management, and now I'm working in the area of public policy and governance.
And because yeah, I mean, I could just see all of these connection points. So so you study management and public policy, and so let's look at your career arc then. What was your first job, and how did that migrate to where you are today?
So I started actually interning in Citibank. Um, I moved away from it because it was a very cutthroat industry and I wanted to do something meaningful. I ended up giving up my dream job, which was advertising, and moving to a company of direct sales, and they were selling water purifiers. So it was something new. I was working in India, and we were asking people who were not boiling water to spend something like 2,000 rupees to buy a water purifier because it kept them safe. And that was the challenge. How do you convince people about the science, that the water is dirty, that there are germs in, when they can't see, they're not literate and not educated? And that, I think, helped me become a better science translator. I see today we have sometimes a lot of experts that struggle in making it simple for maybe the non-scientific audience, and AI is a great example that way. I also do work in synthetic bio, and I see AI and synthetic bio colliding very rapidly, but there are two different fields where sometimes it's very difficult to understand what's going on because it's too technical, right? So that was my career projection. I became a trailing spouse. I moved to Taiwan, then I moved to United Arab Emirates. I worked in Germany. So I've been around in different areas and a lot of reinvention with each step.
So can you describe what you're doing now, and what specifically led to what you're doing now? And then we'll actually go deeper into what you're doing and the impact it's going to have.
So I was in Germany, and my previous dean was working in this particular. I work at the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government. It's very unique because it was set up by the government of Dubai for good policy and governance. So it's a government organization that does master's degrees, and we do consultancy. So it's not a traditional university that does everything else. They brought me in to bring in sort of the more private sector thinking, because the Dubai government is so, I would say, forward-looking and agile. It's constantly changing its strategy. So they wanted us to look at that. A big part of the agenda is artificial intelligence, right? So I look after the innovation product. And what I try and do is try and bring that kind of forward-looking thinking into how can we create safer guardrails for technology, and how can we ensure that it's used for good purpose, because regulations always lag. We're talking about, years.
And in your work, then you have a teaching load, and then you also have a diplomatic kind of load, and that you're training or preparing officials as well. I mean, what's the span of the audience that you're trying to move and make them more aware of the governance and all the policy considerations with artificial intelligence?
So we teach only policy people. So most of them work for government. They either work for the government of UAE, or they work, in some cases, when we do executive teaching, other governments, right? So the idea and focusing on government started because governments are actually one of the largest investors in artificial intelligence when you look behind the scenes, right? Either with a research or through subcontracting. You can see that a lot of projects are actually government funded projects. And that means you need public-private partnerships. So how can we get government officials to understand what it means? You can't use the traditional way of purchasing for AI projects. And at the same time, in some cases, we also work with CEOs of very large companies that work with governments. Same thing, to understand how to do projects really well. I believe it's really about changing mindset, right? So when we train, one is knowledge delivery, but I like to think we also change the way they think, and we give them a heart for purpose again and go back to, values. Is it a human over profit, or is it environment? So how do you prioritize those things, and how do you put that running thread through your entire business operations and strategies?
Because then you're training and providing skills and knowledge, which then they can be applied to policymakers, but also to CEOs or the C-suite. Then what do you think, or what would you say are the biggest misconceptions amongst this audience? Or maybe what is the biggest gaps in their knowledge, would you say?
I think you said it at the beginning, there's 100 forms of intelligence, right? So when we say AI and we say artificial intelligence, it's not really intelligent. It's a machine that processes data. It's a data processing machine, and it does it really well in many different ways. We use the outputs to help us be more intelligent. But I think there itself is the fundamental starting point on how you look at it. Um, and if you don't address that, then we have a problem in everything else down the chain.
So what would be sort of the rough curriculum then? So you get people who realize there's a gap. They want to apply it or use it or invest in it, and some combination probably of all of that. And then, so what is that agenda of onboarding them to some of the early sort of themes of how you're moving them to being sort of proficient so that they can execute in a way that's meaningful, to the middle area where they're gaining more and more experience and they have a better idea, to the finished, when they're at the outcome. What do you want them to know and have? So what's that, I guess, table of contents? What does that look like?
So I guess there's the foundation where you just have to know what's the current terms and what's the current terminologies, what they mean, what they don't mean. I mean, just for example, we're doing a small paper on open source, and everyone assumes open source means everything is open, but it's not necessarily true. It could be one layer, or it could be just data, or it just means there's an API to a proprietary machine. There are strings attached, right? But people don't realize that. So when the media takes on something and says open source, that's everything. People go, oh, it's for good. That's wow. It's a good thing. Not always, right? So I think the foundational layer is just educational. It's just going through some of these things and explaining what it could be, what it could not be, just to make them aware it's okay to ask questions. You should ask questions, challenge everything you're given. The second thing that I like to do is I like to play games. So I give them scenarios, and I'll always ask them where they think the problem was: software, hardware, data. Because I look at AI AI is a software, hardware, data issue, right? And sometimes I have over their purpose. And initially they'll start with it's a software issue, it's a data issue, or it's a hardware issue. But eventually they'll come back down to it's a purpose issue. Someone wasn't sure why they were building this, and therefore you had all these little problems that fell in. The other thing is I give them use cases. I was looking at how gaming evolved to metaverse. And one of the things you found in these young communities is no matter what they did, they could not put the guardrails. It's very hard. And I think the challenge is when you've got, let's say, 3 billion people on the world on the internet, we don't all have the same ethics backgrounds because it's gray, right? Ethics and values. So how would you keep common guardrails? It's impossible. So we bring them to the other point. Have you saved enough money for, I don't know, responsibly managing issues, bugs, hacks? If you're a little bit late on an update, it's hackable. So just by bringing this awareness to them, rather than them outsourcing to a vendor and having no clue what the vendor is doing, I think it raises questions for them, and it realizes maybe we should ask questions about our supply chain. Maybe we should ask how many people are involved. Maybe we should ask the question, do we have enough capacity rather than just assuming AI can do everything? We need human capacity sometimes because it's a machine. Machines fail.
Right. So really giving them a fundamental basis, as you mentioned, they should realize what they're using it for, right? Rather than, gee, I must use it because everybody's saying I have to use it. You got to have some kind of objective, right? And then you could develop a roadmap of how do you achieve that objective, and whether it even makes sense to use AI. It could be some other aspect of the whole analytics process or big data that could solve the problem without getting into the actual AI side. So that's interesting. And then I thought that was really interesting too about the open source. You're right. Open source is such a big word. And in fact, in my keynotes, I just usually say open source, but there's many grades of open source. And as you indicated, there could be strings or there are often strings attached of how you can use it and things like that. And there's even guidelines on Creative Commons, right? So there's nothing that's just a blank slate. There's all of these governance rules or other kinds of access rules around it, and you have to be aware of that. And I can see all of those things make a lot of sense if somebody just doesn't know, right? So at the end of this, what can they do? Like if you were to say, you've got learning objectives, right? So at the end of it, what can you say in terms of the learning objectives that have been achieved from somebody who has finished one of your programs? And it'll be an ongoing thing too, as well.
So yes, so right now we're doing very short bursts, but I hope at the end of, if we deploy an entire program from end to end, that they will walk away understanding better what role AI can play in their business, their organization, and then how they could set up responsible, accountable systems where they have values prioritized. So go back to what their values are. And different organizations will have different values and purposes, and that's okay. I don't think everyone needs to be philanthropic or anything else. But if they want to be conscientious, they don't want to do the whitewashing ESG kind of thing, and they want to listen to long-term impact, and you're looking, you need to kind of understand what that means, right? So you might do scope 1, scope 2 carbon emissions, and you think, okay, I'm doing really well, but you haven't looked at scope 3, and AI has a huge scope 3 carbon emission. So I think just understanding some of those things will make them then think about small things they can do in an organization. For example, when you send an email, if you send it to 5,000 people and you put an attachment with it, and everyone has 5,000 emails with a huge attachment, that's a huge carbon footprint, right? Whereas you could put a link and the attachment could lie on a server and only those people interested in it will download it. But that requires re-educating in small things. And that's a good way to start. But maybe the awareness helps them think about little things and even the big things in the long term.
You'll give the people the skills to do the right kind of project and sort of set up the construct for a project, right? To initiate AI within some pilot and maybe scale that into maybe a bigger sort of implementation, and then they could scale it enterprise wide. And then you have a governance framework around it, but the governance framework will incorporate it within it, the ethical use of it in some way, right? And it addresses values in a positive way, and to think forward so that what is the sustainability impact of all of what you're doing, and to be mindful so that you can make it sustainable in a positive and productive way, and not the greenwashing ESG, but a true ESG sort of mindset, right? And greenwashing to the audience, of course, is where you're kind of pretending you're doing something good, but really, if you look deep enough, it's not having any positive outcome. Have you captured this into some kind of a document that's available that anybody can download or take a look at, or do they have to go through your program, or can they go to your website and there's material that they can access?
So I blog it www.melodena.com. So there's some material there. I have a book. So the book also has a lot of use cases and examples and maybe questions for them to reflect on while they're taking decisions on AI. So I think it's really, why are you using AI and what is the role it plays in your business? I believe AI has tremendous opportunity. Don't get me wrong. There is a tremendous opportunity to do good, but you still need to monitor it, right? You can't. So if we put up the guardrails, and I love that word, guardrails, if we think about trade-offs, I hate the word risks. I think risks is very simplistic. Very often we're dealing with trade-offs, you know, the good and the bad. There will always be something bad, but you make a conscious choice on the trade-offs. I think we would have safer AI.
So you have this book. Can you put the book up again?
Sure.
I'm just fascinated by that book. So it's called AI to Enable Business, and you say a smart decision kit. Can you describe maybe just the table of contents of what you have in your book? You know, the different chapters.
Sure. So what we did is we went through a brief history of AI, and we went through some of the background, like for example, the human agent collectives that is coming up, how humans are working with AI and becoming teams. We went through some background of how the firms are changing, but what we introduced is the need for exponential thinking as opposed to linear thinking, right? So I think with AI, the pace at which it is growing and the possibility of adjacent possible, that means you cannot look at your industry alone. You have to look at how other industries are colliding. And I'll give you an example. Now with brain-computer interfaces, now with the ability to store data in DNA, we are looking at whole other systems very rapidly coming in. So that exponential thinking is a skill that's there. We have a couple of scales in the book that we use. For example, I'll just show you an example of a scale like this. And the idea, we explain what we mean by the scale with cases and examples, and then say, if you decide to go on one extreme, it means more resources. You need more money, you need more people, you have to invest in that more time. And that is a choice you make. You can't pretend you're at that extreme and then have no resources. And I think that's an important one because some research that's coming out says 70 to 80% of AI projects fail because sometimes it's not enough money or resources put into that. They didn't think that you would need maybe double the amount of money because every year you have to do a software upgrade, a hardware upgrade, cybersecurity gets more expensive, and the data becomes obsolete, right? So you need new data. So
I mean, that's fascinating. And then, so what are some of the other chapters that you go through?
oh yeah, sure. So I go through, I'll just kind of mention some of the table of contents that are there. We look at, for example, AI and decision making. So we go through what do we mean by decision making and what role AI should play in decision making and when it should come in. What is the level of AI expertise that's required when you're making some of these choices? And also, what is the level of expertise required for an organization as you go and default more decisions to an AI? AI operations, we're looking at things like interoperability. How do you embed it across globally, especially now considering geopolitical issues coming up, different types of data, and how do you manage that? The role of employees with AI, how do you train employees to manage it better? AI and customers, especially since a lot of work is happening on customer experiences, AI regulations, and then we have at the end new things that we want them to think about. For example, humanoids that will come out in future. I mentioned synthetic biology, which I think is really important, and the metaverse. I mean, metaverse is already there in bits and pieces. You can see it in digital twins and all, but if it becomes fully immersive, what does that mean for us in society?
So you talk about synthetic biology. What do you mean by synthetic biology?
Uh, this is the artificial engineering of genetic material, and it's being done right now. If you had a Pfizer vaccine, for example, your COVID vaccine was synthetic biology. Behind the scenes, we're using a lot of AI. So we're using AI to go and match DNA, and even in some cases to engineer these molecules, right? So I think this becomes interesting on the role of AI on behind the scenes in creating these new molecules and their impact that they're having on the world. So the reason why I mentioned synthetic bio, and even though AI is not at the, AI is behind the scenes in the value chain, is because you're dealing with an environmental system. It's a complex system. We don't understand how everything fits in together. So we genetically engineer a mosquito and you leave it loose in the ecosystem. We don't know the long-term impacts on such things like that. So there are several different experiments happening around the world with this. It's too early for us to know the impact, but I thought it was important to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, I can see now, I mean, the implications of synthetic biology, there's all sorts of gene manipulation, even insertion of genes into plants and insects and animals and things like that. You can actually create DNA now, or kind of like a totally artificially, right? So, and what are the implications of that? Especially when there isn't really an understanding of a lot of the great, big segments of what used to they think were like junk parts, but now they realize they aren't junk. They do something, and yet we're tinkering with it, right? So what? And then of course there's kind of the whole organism side where um, even a better manifestation of cloning and the impact of that. So I guess it's a really broad spectrum. And then marrying that and how you're doing genetic manipulation um, to create hybrids in some way, and what does that mean, right? And then, as you indicated earlier, there's a lot of work in human machine interfaces and the implications. And though the term metaverse is now a popular term, but it's still there. It's still progressing, right? The extended reality, the sort of this combination of augmented virtual mixed reality we call it extended reality, but that's still there and it's still progressing. And of course, Apple released the Apple Vision Pro this year, though it's not getting the adoption that they had originally forecasted. So you see a lot of news on that right now. But it's going to evolve, right? It's going to get simpler, and especially with brain-computer interfaces, then it could be totally transparent. I mean, you just don't see it. So you're looking at that, right? And the implications of that. So if you were to look at what life would be like by 2030, can you paint a picture of what a person's experience could be? It may not be. We may not progress that fast by that time, but it's a non-zero. There is a possibility. So can you look?
I'll give you an example of what I do in class. So I ask my students to think of what life will be in maybe 20, when they're 75 as an example. And they will talk about robots and, flying cars, and they have this vision of what life would be. They just sit and everything appears, it's all perfect. And then I ask them to close their eyes and I ask them, how old will you be? And somebody says, oh, I'm 85. Someone says, I'm 95. Someone says, I'm 70. And I say, okay, that's great. Now, put yourself in this life that you've designed. And they go, where's the children? I'm like, the children are busy doing their own thing. They've sent the robot to take care of you. But I want my children next to me. I'm sorry, you didn't plan for that. It's too late. No, but can we go back and change it? No, you've already designed this future. Now you have to live it. So it's a little bit of a shock for them suddenly, because they never thought about things like the social impacts and things like that. I hope in 2030, we have a peaceful world, right? I hope in 2030, we spend a little time to talk to each other, maybe pat someone on the back, actually spend a minute with our neighbor, because with COVID, some of that kind of just disappeared. And I love Zoom calls and all, but I think I love meeting people face to face much better. So we need to get in touch with that. We need to get in touch with nature. Nature's not putting on a virtual headset and immersing yourself in a forest to calm yourself down. It is going out to a forest and realizing it takes, I don't know, 150 years for the tree to grow and caretaking it for that. So I hope 2030, the world would be greener, safer, more peaceful.
That's an interesting exercise where you get people to imagine what they're going to be and what the world that they're immersed in at some older age, but them not thinking of the implications of what they envision to their children, to the environment, to the planet, to other life forms, and then our position within the universe, I guess, sort of the broader question. And because there's this convergence between, quantum computing and some of the early indications of things happening. In fact, there's a company called Quantinuum, and they had a big announcement with Microsoft where they were able to reduce the errors of their quantum bits by 800 times by forming these what they call logical qubits. But it was really a significant milestone, because if you can get stability in the way the quantum computer works, then you can get that to solve real problems, not toy problems or impractical things, right? Impractical things meaning they throw tests at them, but really there's no practical application, though it's amazing. But now we're at this sort of crux, this sort of fidelity point of 3 or 4 nines, where it's going to exceed classical computers. So there's that, and then there's all of the biomedical innovation you talked about, of which a piece would be the genetics side, the synthetic biology side. All of the chip technology is just going through the roof. So much investment. They're getting smaller. There's photonic chips. I mean, it's ones with AI embedded. The sort of the breakthroughs that are just occurring daily on AI machine learning. And so there's a confluence of all of this. Do you think that that's going to upend our planning, because we'll be to address problems that we didn't even consider could be solved or even looked at? Do you think about those implications, or do you talk about it?
I do, yes. So quantum computing, you need large quantities of data, right? But more importantly, if you want to check error, you need people who can go through that. The speed at which these computers churn out data, I don't know, if you had to fact check it, how many years would it take somebody to do that? So there's this little gap that's coming in between we want to check, and I know there's a lot of talk about this in some of like the AI Act and all of that, but we're using proxies to check the quality, because you cannot go through everything that the computer does. You just don't have the human capacity at the speed at which it computes. This is going to be a challenge, right? I also think it's interesting that we would trust the instinct, and I'm going to use the word instinct, of an AI computer through a black box, but we would not trust a human being's gut instinct. Why? So we need to perhaps come back and ask that, what makes us human? And we did this in the synthetic bio class, and no one kind of had an answer of what makes us human. What's the quality that makes us human and separates us from a machine? Because we're struggling with some of these things. I do think if we have good quality data and we have a narrow problem, or good quality data, even if it's a big problem, I don't know, throw in all the earthquakes and maybe all the weather things, you'll come up with something interesting. But again, a human being should also look at that and interpret it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a proliferation of questions, because we're at this crux of or this transition of so many unknowns, right? And we're dabbling in areas that will have a profound systemic impact, and in areas that we don't really fully understand, but we're actually putting tremendous amount of resources into it. And you alluded to this in this aspect that the AI is quite opaque. We don't really know what's going on, and yet we're investing so much of us into using AI and machine learning, and though we don't understand really what's going on internally. So, and that, I guess it'd be interesting. And like you said, there's so much output being created that we as humans we don't have the means to actually check it, right? We have to actually use other systems we have to automate it. But can you trust that automation, right? And yet it's going to have this systemic or big, huge impact, a system-wide impact. So how do we address these big questions? So
I think knowing the limitations or the boundary conditions, right? So if you understand the boundary in which the decision is being taken, let me take an example. If we look at all the data that's being currently used, that's on the internet and everything, it's younger people that are creating it. A lot of it is video data, right? It's on Instagram, social media, YouTube. These are not old people. So we've already marginalized a lot of old people. Like my mother isn't on these platforms as an example, right? So some people are, but a large majority aren't. We've also marginalized very young children who aren't able to put that content. We've marginalized maybe places which don't have access to the internet, and that's huge. If you go and look at how many people have access to the internet to create content. So then what information are we getting, and is it representative of the humans that we're taking a decision on? So if we start looking at boundary conditions and ask those questions, I think we'd be more insightful to know how to use AI, and then maybe even to put, preconditions on how it should work its algorithm to reduce bias. I don't think you can ever completely reduce bias. So that's something inherently you will always have to dwell with. So the question comes back, can you recognize it?
yeah, and I guess the question too is bias is a really personalized sort of view, right? So different individuals have different biases, different cultures and regions have different biases, and they're different. I mean, even by an individual, we're different. We're sort of living in a virtual world, right? My view and what I hear, and I wear hearing aids, so what I hear is different from what other people hear. I wear glasses, so my view of the world is different. And each person has their own individual viewpoint, which then introduces their own sort of bias of what that world consists of. And then as a collective, it happens, and that could be a collective of your family, and it could be a collective of the city or a particular region. Each has its own orientation. Then it's national. Then it's continental. Then it's sort of peer groups globally that you sit in. Each has its own point of view, but that point of view is really a bias. So how do you mitigate all of that? And then we as humans have a collective bias versus other life forms. Right. And each life form has its own particular view of the world and its experiences. And I was struck by this declaration that came out of New York a few days ago, and where a group of very prominent scientists who study consciousness or kind of the sentience aspect, they came up with this statement that they think that it's much broader than just humans. And they came up with a declaration saying, you know what? And it's created controversy that they think that's really, really broad and it's out there and it's not just encapsulated human. So how do you address the orientation? Maybe I'm not going to use the word bias, but which is really bias of everything, and how do you manage all of that, right? So and how do you respect it?
You need diverse people at the group. You need men, you need women, you need different genders, you need people to come in from different places, different levels of expertise to have a conversation. There's no other way you can do it. You have to have a conversation where you're willing to listen, and you've got to have a conversation where you're willing for your assumptions to be challenged. The thing is, it will keep constantly changing, right? So you'll uncover a bias, but humans are not static. We evolve constantly, every moment by our experiences. So you might have uncovered a bias at point A in one point in time. 10 minutes later, something else will pop up. So that ability of agility, you mentioned that word, I think you really need to be agile, but you need that systems. This means an organizational culture which is listening. So it's not just, the people, the sales or the C-suite. Everybody needs to be networked and passing information so you can collect it early and then go back and work on it.
Yeah, I mean, you have to practice this idea of non-flict. I belong to a board called Million Peacemakers, and we have this thing called non-flict, where you spend time listening and understanding the other. And in fact, anytime you communicate with somebody, you make sure that you rephrase what they're saying to make sure you understand, or you give your view of what they just said to make sure you are respecting what that other person is saying. And that's is about communication, right? And then having diversity in that communication, and hearing all voices, even though you may not agree with that other voice, but taking the time to try to understand the other voice. It's a nice ideal, but yet the world is becoming more chaotic. And there's over 80 elections happening this year. So it's a kind of an inflection point in the planet. I can see the value of your work, because you're trying to uh, address all of these big questions that are at this pivotal moment in history. And I can see how that could be an entire curriculum on ongoing work in progress with the C-suite that you work with, and also with the policymakers and so on that you work with. If there were, and this is the last question, if we're at the end of this chat, and to the audience, all of my chats are unscripted, so just a bit of a reminder. And in fact, I just asked Melodena, we were happy to meet you, and said, hey, would you be willing to go into an unscripted interview? So she said, agreed. So thank you for that.
Oh, my pleasure.
Is there any sort of lasting recommendations that you want to leave the audience? I recommend the audience read your book. So are there other lasting recommendations for the audience?
Ask questions. I lived with scientists, and you sometimes feel like you're stupid to ask fundamental questions and say, break that down for me. Don't let them intimidate you. Ask questions, talk to me like I'm a 3-year-old and tell me exactly what's happening, because somewhere there you'll find the answers of how to build better systems. If they talk down to you and tell you you don't know what you're talking about, then you're not going to be able to help them do a better job, nor are you going to be able to create a better system. And again, AI has so much promise. We are probably at the inflection of a whole new evolution of humankind, but we have to do it right and ensure that it's good not only for us, but for the future generation and the planet.
Yeah, I mean, asking questions is so key, and even what we consider what we call counterfactual questions, right? So you have a series of facts associated with something, but what if you did some alternative scenarios, which are counterfactual scenarios, counter to the facts, and asking questions in that way, then you have a much better understanding of the potential outcomes and to mitigate risk as well. So, thank you for coming in and doing this ad hoc conversation. I really enjoyed it. I know you have to go to another meeting, so thank you again for doing it.
Thank you for having me, and a pleasure. Hope to catch up soon.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.